Hi, in this lecture we are going to learn what are the exceptions and exception types in BASIC. While coding your business, compiler finds the errors most of the times because what you will do is generally obvious and compiler can easily check that. So how? For example, if you forget to write a semicolon at the end, or if you misspelled something, or if you try to use a variable before declaring it, the compiler catches these errors. We can think of hundreds of errors that the compiler shows us before we run the query. But the errors does not end up with these. There are lots of errors that the compiler cannot find out before running. Let's say you are deleting two variables and these variables are taken from some parameters. The compiler cannot know that you will divide a number with a zero value. You can never know. Or sometimes we select some values from the database into our variables. How can a compiler know that it will return more than one value into one variable? It can never know before running the code. These errors are occurred while running, and I said before that runtime errors are the error types that we avoid most. Compile errors will not harm your data because it is thrown before running. But runtime errors may cause irrecoverable data loss or changes. Not so often, but maybe you will lose your job because of that. So you need to be careful on that. Actually, you need to handle that runtime errors. To handle these, we face with the exceptions sections. If you are familiar with another programming language, you already know what the exceptions are. But let me explain for those who doesn't know. Exceptions are designed for handling the runtime errors. When the plsql block faces with any error while running, it directly throws an exception and terminates the execution. We can call that as raising the exception. So what is raising an exception? If your block is an anonymous block, the exception is raised, and since this block is not called by another one, it will directly end up and output the error detail in the script output. But if you face an exception in a subprogram like functions, procedures, etc., or if you face that in another platform like Oracle Forms or Java, the exception is thrown or raised into these subprograms or platforms. So you need to handle these if you don't want your program to crash. You need to handle that either in your plsql block or in other platforms that you raise the exception in it. In plsql block, you can handle that or you can raise it to the program that called your block to pass the exception handling. So how we handle exceptions? Actually, you faced with the exceptions several times before. Let me show you an example for that. Let's run this sample code for now. As you can see, we get some data into our variable. And as we can see, no problem. But what if we change our employee ID to 50? Because we know that there is no employee with the ID of 50 in our employees table. Let's change and run again. Clear up and run our code. As we can see, our exception is raised and our code is terminated. Up to now, we called it as we had an error. But now we know that these errors are called as exceptions. Now what we see in the output? Exceptions have two main attributes, the error code and the explanation. Our error codes always start with the ORA or ORA prefix and continues with a negative number. As we can see in here, it says ORA minus 01403. This is our error code. This code has a negative interval that we can assign, but I will show that later. When you face with any exception, if you search this code in the internet, you will find many solutions about your problem. Because these error codes are unique and specific for an exception. Then, after the error code, we face with a brief explanation for the error. In here it says that no data found. These are two main attributes of the exception. After writing these, we see some more explanations in here. They are for further knowledge. It says this may cause the problem, and you can follow these actions to handle that problem. But this may not be accurate all the times. So if you cannot deal with your problem with checking these messages, you can search the error code on the internet and find many other solutions from the developers who faced with the similar problems before. But you cannot solve all the problems all the times. I mean, you cannot be sure that there will not be any no data found problem in the future. We face such situations most of the times, so we cannot come to the code and correct the problem and go on. This is not possible all the times. So we have to handle that problem to protect our code against any crash. For this, we use the exception section. As we can see in the result set, when the code faced with the exception, it directly terminated the code. So our hello text is not written in the output. But we can do some last things before terminating our code. At that point, we face with the exception section. We can say that our block has three sections. The first one is the declaration section. We know that we declare our variables, cursors, etc. in this section. The second one is begin-end section. We do our job in this section. The last section is the exception section. If we face with any exception in the begin-end section, our program stops executing the next lines in our begin-end block and directly enters to the exception section. You do some last things in here about your exception. For example, if you inserted some rows, you can delete them back. Or you can print some informative explanations. Or many other things. But be aware that there is no returning back. That means when the program executes the exception section, it finishes our whole block. No turn back for continuing with the begin-end block. This section is for a graceful exit. Your block finishes anyway. Alright, an exception can be raised with two ways. Either the Oracle server implicitly raises it, or we can explicitly raise it. In the example we have seen here, Oracle server raised the error and terminated our block. Like that one, we can raise some errors based on our rules. We will see how to do that in our next lectures. Once an exception is raised, we can handle that with three options. The first one is we can trap it with an exception handler method. Means catch it and take some actions for that. The second one is we directly propagate it to the calling subprogram or environment. So we pass the handling job to some others. If we do not handle that error, the server will automatically propagate that error to the caller program. The third one is we trap it, do some actions, but propagate it to the caller anyway. Means we say, I did some actions, but you take your actions too. So how will we know that we will face with an exception? Actually, most of the times you should guess. But first, you need to know the possible issues that will cause the exceptions. So we need to know these exceptions and why they occur. Then we need to check our code and find out the issues that causes these exceptions. In the example I showed to you, we need to think that what if there is no data in our selected query result set? We need to consider these possible situations. Actually, in new programming languages, their compilers warn you about these exceptions. But in plsql, we need to find them out by ourselves. Or the second way is facing with the exceptions while running. But this is the worst case. Maybe you can check your code with some test data, but this will not be the exact solution. Because test data generally differs from the real one, so you need to find out by yourself. Actually, this is not so hard because the common exceptions are not so much and you face with these exceptions at very most of the times. So you will easily say that this will raise that error or something. You will get used to it. Alright, I think this is enough for the exceptions introduction. We will continue with using the exceptions in the next lectures. So this is the end of this lecture. See you in the next one.